Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. And now I recognize Mr. Kontorovich for your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Representative Baird, Ranking Member Moskowitz, honorable members of the subcommittee. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about how to reform the United Nations. We all agree some reform is needed, but how to do it. Congress has been discussing the UN's lack of accountability and need for reform for decades. Yet Turtle Bay's budget increases almost ineluctably, and it continues to expand its sphere of operations and ambitions. We need to adopt new tools to force UN reform or scale down our involvement in a lasting way. Let's be honest, this is not easy because the UN is designed for maximum non-accountability. As a supranational institution with nearly 200 member states, the monitoring and agency problems inherent in government are amplified. It's run by a treaty from 1945 that can't be amended without the consent of all states. So most UN reform efforts have focused on cutting or withholding funds. This is an important tool which we must certainly use, but it's not enough. History shows that the UN often relapses and drops reforms when a less determined administration comes into office. Reforms get abandoned. So the remainder of my testimony will explain 3 discrete methods to lock in change short of quitting. This means looking not just where problems are, but where the pressure points are. My focus is not necessarily on the UN's biggest failings, but rather areas where there is both need for reform and the ability for the United States to force it in a unilateral and durable way, thus pushing back on the accretive inertial processes by which the UN blob expands. These 3 strategies, in brief, using the Security Council veto to pare back peacekeeping, exiting individual specialized agencies, as well as treaties giving the ICJ jurisdiction, and finally reasserting Congress's role and authority over decisions to join UN organizations. Let's start by discussing peacekeeping missions. Most bloated, politicized, and ineffective UN entities, from UNRWA to the Human Rights Council, cannot be canceled by the United States. Peacekeeping missions are the exception because they require typically annual reauthorization from the Security Council, which means the United States can veto that reauthorization. Once vetoed, a peacekeeping mission cannot be resurrected without a new affirmative Security Council vote. Some peacekeeping missions have played valuable roles, but like many UN entities, they continue to exist long after any real need for them has ended. Indeed, the UN derives influence and patronage opportunities from these missions, whose blue helmets make the organization seem like a real power. So the Trump administration has already begun to sunset UNIFIL. That's a powerful, important example to end this year, but it's not over until it's over. Some other examples of missions that can be reevaluated: UNDOF in the Golan Heights is supposed to supervise a demilitarized zone between Israel and Syria, but it runs away whenever the shooting starts. Changes on the ground after the Syrian civil war make this DMZ irrelevant, and the organization has never been able to prevent conflict. Other missions are perpetually plagued by scandal and abuse of the kind no American taxpayer should be forced to subsidize. MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of Congo, MINUSCA in the Central African Republic have, for years between them, accounted for the vast majority, almost all, of sex abuse claims against UN peacekeepers. There's something fundamentally broken and unfixable in those missions. We can use the veto of these missions not just to scale down the scope of UN peacekeeping, but also as a pressure point to leverage change over other UN agencies. Now, second, exiting specialized agencies. The United Nations is not just one organization, it's a web of entities. Most of them we cannot quit without quitting the United Nations. Some have individual treaties and individual membership, which we can begin to re-examine. However, like little-used online subscriptions, America's membership in such organizations proceeds unexamined through inertia. Take the International Organization on Migration, which has proposed a global carbon tax. Ambassador Waltz and the Trump administration managed to stop that last year. But ultimately, to keep America out of this system, we're going to have to take America potentially out of the organization. The International Organization for Migration, $1.7 billion a year, sponsors the Global Compact for Migration, which the U.S. has described as not compatible with U.S. sovereignty. Now, finally, once we leave these and other organizations, we need to make sure that re-entry is not just a revolving door. Now, when the U.S. joined the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and other of these organizations, Congress had to affirmatively vote to approve membership. But when the U.S. has re-entered UNESCO 3 times now, no separate congressional authorization was forthcoming. That's a mistake. Congress should have to approve re-entry. It's not a season ticket or a lifetime pass. Authorization of membership should be a one-time use. Otherwise, these agencies become like a dreary version of the Hotel California, where you can check out anytime but never leave. Thank you. I look forward to a question.
And also the double peril of having a number of member states who simply don't see eye to eye with the United States in terms of advancing these policies.
If you took a textualist approach to the UN Charter, Iran would be ineligible as a non-peace-loving state.
I think there's bipartisan agreement that there are major issues. I think where there's some disagreement is, do you use the budget to try to reform it, right? Do you use the threat of support to try to reform it, or do you leave? And the do you leave situation for me, I just don't see how that gets better. So I just wanted to discuss that.
Could I address the hypothetical?
Yeah, please.
So I don't think leaving is within the political horizon,
Okay.
which is why I don't address it. But I think it is worth looking at what would happen, because the argument, but China's going to take over, or China will sort of eat our cake if we pull back, is one of the major arguments against U.S. pullback at the United Nations. But I think it's worth saying that the United Nations without the United States is not the same United Nations. It is not the same prize for China to take over. With the United States in, it makes sense for China to try to assert influence because it has vastly more credibility. Without the United Nations, not just in budgetary terms, 25%, right? It's in theory, a fundamentally different organization. I don't think anyone wants to be in Beijing as much as they want to be in New York, and parking would certainly be much better. So I wouldn't catastrophize it. There would be definitely drawbacks, but what I think is catastrophic is ruling that out as an option from the beginning, because it makes it a too big to fail lock-in situation.
Well, but actually a great point, right? Is the UN too big to fail, right? I mean, that's a good question, which, I understand maybe from a negotiation standpoint, you don't want to take any option off the table. I'm fine with that. But really, reform seems to be the main option, the best of all options, rather than like what we did with the WHO.
Which is less than quitting the United Nations. Right? That's a kind of scaled down version.
Okay.
Address your concern.
Yeah, I would agree with Mr. Schaefer's comments and add, we need to make sure that when the UN commits, when the UN, members, employees commit terrorism and with American victims, that American victims be able to sue in American courts. Currently, UN organizations, UN employees, have greater immunity than the President of the United States. The UN has greater immunity than foreign countries. If a foreign country, like Korea or North Korea or Iran, sponsor terrorism, you can sue them in U.S. courts. But due to lacunae in the International Organizations Immunity Act, there is no such textual allowance for lawsuits against UN entities or other international organizations that sponsor terror. Senator Cruz introduced an excellent bill last year, the Liable Act, which would allow for suing international organizations that provide material support to terror groups, and it would be wonderful to see something like that come out of the House. Thanks. UNESCO is a perfect example of the difficulty of reform. America has now rejoined 3 times, quit twice, the first time under Ronald Reagan. George Bush rejoined because it was supposed to, they said, we have a new director, we're reformed, and then they went and, basically said Jerusalem has no link to the Jewish people. We've seen that happen yet again, right? When they had their last meeting the year before President Trump quit again, 3 out of 11 subject areas were focused on Israel. They then recognized Jericho as a Palestinian site with no connection to Jewish or Christian history. I like culture and I like science as much as the next person, but it's not clear that those inchoate values really require a UN agency to advance them.